Welcome to Cat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, I'm Kat, and this is Cat Has Questions. Today I've got a little bit different of a story for you. Not necessarily a murder, probably, but still has a lot of weird elements, a lot of maybe natural things, maybe some conspiracy dribbled in there. So with that, let's get into it. On February 26th, 1959, two searchers were crossing the eastern slope of a mountain in the northern Ural region of the Soviet Union, now Russia. And also, let me just preface this now. This case takes place in Russia. A lot of the names are Russian. A lot of things are going to be hard for me to pronounce. I'm going to do my best to pronounce them correctly, but I'm probably not going to do a great job at it. So I'll do what I can. So these two searchers were looking for a missing group of hikers for days. And finally, through the snow, they saw something. A tent. Or what was left of one. The tent had partially collapsed beneath a layer of hardened, windblown snow. One side was still secured to a ski pole, but most of the long canvas structure had fallen inward. Several skis remained positioned beneath it. An ice axe stood near the entrance. A flashlight was lying on top of the snow. When one of the searchers picked it up and switched it on, it was still working. Inside the tent were the hikers' backpacks, their food, blankets, cameras, their money, their tools, and most importantly, their winter boots and warm clothing. But the 9 people who belonged inside the tent were gone. Investigators would determine that several long cuts in the fabric had been made from inside the shelter. Below the campsite, searchers found tracks. 9 sets of footprints appeared to move together down the exposed mountainside. Some had been made by people wearing socks, some by people wearing soft felt footwear, and at least one person appeared to have been wearing only a single shoe. Some prints seemed to have been made by bare feet. The tracks continued toward the forest approximately a mile below the campsite. After about 500 meters, the trail disappeared beneath fresh snow. But there was no trail leading back. At the edge of the forest, searchers found the remains of a small fire beneath a large Siberian cedar tree. 2 bodies were lying nearby. 3 more would be discovered on the slope between the tree and the abandoned tent. And then, more than 2 months later, after this, the remaining 4 hikers would be found beneath approximately 13 feet of snow in a ravine. Some had died from hypothermia. Others had suffered massive internal injuries, including crushed ribs and a catastrophic skull fracture. 2 were missing their eyes. 1 was missing her tongue and portions of tissue around her face. Some of the clothing showed traces of radioactive contamination. And the original Soviet investigation eventually concluded that all 9 people had been killed by what some translated as, quote, a compelling natural force. Which is technically a conclusion, but it's not much of an explanation. What could have convinced 9 experienced winter hikers to cut their way out of their shelter and descend into the freezing darkness without their boots? Why did they seem to leave together rather than scatter in panic? How did several of them suffer injuries compared to those seen in a serious car crash? And after decades of UFOs, secret weapons, murderers, radioactive experiments, infrasound, and even a supposed Yeti being blamed for their deaths, is this mystery actually as impossible as it sounds? Or have the strangest details been repeated so many times that they have buried the most likely answer? This is the Dyatlov Pass incident. Before we begin, there are 2 important things to understand about this story. First, the people involved were real. They were not characters in a horror movie, and they were not careless teenagers wandering into a mountain range with no idea what they were doing. They were experienced Soviet hikers. They had trained for difficult winter conditions. They knew how to build fires, navigate, ski through deep snow, and construct emergency shelters. Several of them were completing their expedition to qualify for the highest hiking certification available in the Soviet Union at the time. Second, there are dozens of different versions of this case. Some contain verified evidence from the original investigation. Others repeat details that appeared years or even decades later. And many combine those things without making it clear which is which. So, throughout this episode, I'm going to separate 3 things: what the original investigation documented, what can reasonably be inferred from that evidence, and what remains only a theory. Because there are parts of the Dyatlov Pass that are genuinely strange. We do not need to make them stranger than they already are. In January 1959, 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov organized a winter skiing expedition through the northern Ural Mountains. Igor was a radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsky, the city now known as Yekaterinburg. He had already completed difficult winter trips and had experienced camping above the tree line, where there was no shelter from the wind and no easy access to firewood. The route he had planned was approximately 300 kilometers, or about 186 miles, and was expected to take roughly 18 days. The expedition was designated Category 3, the highest level of difficulty recognized in the Soviet Union at that time. The group planned to travel through the far northern region of Sverdlovsky Oblast, following portions of the Lozva River before reaching Mount Otorten. Their route was formally approved by the City Route Commission in early January. They received their official route book on January 23, 1959, and departed Sverdlovsky the same day. The original party consisted of 10 people. There was Igor Dyatlov, the leader, Zinaida Kolmogorova, called Zina, who was 22, Ludmila Dubinina, called Luda, who was 20, Rustem Slobodin, who was 23, Georgy Korvanshienko, who often went by Yuri or Yura, who was also 23, Yuri Doroshenko, who was 21, Nikolai Tibobrinilo, who was 23, and Alexander Kolvator, who was 24. And finally, Seman Zolotarvoy, the oldest member of the expedition, and Yuri Yudin, who would become the only member of the original group to return home. Once again, apologies for probably mispronouncing a lot of that. I even have the pronunciations typed out next to their names, and I am probably still butchering it. So the one person of those people I just listed who was different from that group was Seman Zolotarvov. He had served during World War II, worked as a hiking instructor, and joined the expedition after another participant dropped out. So he was older than some of these other ones who were all kind of young 20s. He reportedly preferred to be called Sasha, even though his legal first name was Semyon. He was actually turning 38 on February 1st, 1959, the final day documented in the group's diaries. On January 25th, the hikers arrived by train in the northern portion of the Sverdlovsky Oblast. The next day, they traveled by truck to Vizhai, generally considered the last permanently inhabited settlement along their route. So they traveled to a city that was the last established city, basically, before starting their hike. Their diaries and photographs show a group that seemed relaxed and excited. They sang together, they joked, they played music. They entertained school children by explaining their hiking equipment and telling stories from expeditions. And at one station, Kurenvashenko began singing and jokingly held out his hat for money. Police briefly detained him because they believed he was actually begging. On another day, the group spent hours riding in the back of a truck with broken springs and unreliable brakes, while temperatures remained well below freezing. Their group diary described them passing the time by discussing friendship, happiness, love, illness, and almost anything else they could think of. This matters because some later theories suggest that serious conflict was already developing within the expedition. But the diaries do contain small disagreements. There was teasing, there were occasional frustrations, there were references to romantic feelings that were not necessarily returned. Basically, it sounds like 10 young adults who were exhausted, freezing, and spending every minute together. But there is no clear evidence of a major feud or of the group falling apart before the night they died. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin decided that he could not continue. Yuri had a history of health problems and was experiencing significant pain in his knees and joints. He had hoped the pain would improve as the expedition continued, but it became clear that pressing forward into a remote mountain region would endanger both him and the rest of the group. Leaving was deeply disappointing. Photographs showed Yuri saying goodbye to his friends. He hugged Ludmila and watched as the remaining 9 hikers packed their equipment and continued north. No one could have known that he was the last person outside the expedition to see them alive. For the rest of his life, Yuri would live with the knowledge that the health problems he resented at the time were the only reason he survived. The remaining group found Lozva River and then moved toward the valley of Ospia River. The weather became increasingly difficult. Temperatures dropped well below zero. Strong winds pushed snow through the trees. Visibility came and went. But none of that was entirely unexpected. They had deliberately planned a Category 3 winter expedition that February. Difficult conditions were kind of the point. That's part of what made it one of the hardest expeditions to get that certificate. On January 31st, they reached the edge of the highland region and camped in a forested valley near the tree line. There, they created a supply cache known as a labaz. They left behind extra food, equipment, and other items that they would not need during the portion of that trip. So basically, they kind of leave it in this little area. They go on further into the trip, and then on their way back, then they can get the supplies again that they left in this labaz. On the morning of February 1st, they left the cache and began climbing away from the trees. The wind was strong, snow was falling, visibility continued to deteriorate. At some point, the group drifted away from its intended route and moved west toward the upper portion of Holat Saikal. The name is often translated as Dead Mountain. The translation sounds ominous now for obvious reasons, but it did not necessarily mean that the local indigenous people called the Mansi believed the mountain was cursed or deadly. The name may have referred more practically to an area with little game for hunters. When the hikers realized they had moved off course, they faced a decision. They could descend approximately a mile back toward the forest, where they would have shelter from the wind and access to firewood, or they could remain on the exposed slope and preserve the elevation they had already gained. Igor chose the slope. This decision has been criticized for decades, but it was not necessarily reckless. Descending would mean climbing the same elevation again the following morning and losing all that ground they had gained. Camping above the tree line also gave the group an opportunity to practice the kind of cold weather overnight that was part of an advanced expedition training. So the hikers began preparing a campsite. Photographs recovered from their cameras show them cutting into the snow to create a level platform. They arranged skis beneath the tent to create a foundation. Backpacks, blankets, and quilted clothing were used to insulate the floor. The entrance faced generally south, away from the direction they had been traveling. They did not assemble the stove that night, and that may indicate they arrived late or were tired and planned to eat a relatively simple meal before sleeping. So if they weren't making their stove, clearly they were not intending to cook with it. Inside the tent, they created a humorous group newspaper called Evening o Torten. It includes jokes about the expedition and a brief reference to a, quote, snowman. Years later, that joke would be pulled out of context and used as evidence that the hikers had encountered a Yeti. It wasn't a warning. There is no diary entry describing a creature following the group, and there's no final message saying something was outside. As far as the group's own surviving records show, they settled into the tent, expecting an uncomfortable but normal night on the mountain. And then, sometime during the night of February 1st into February 2nd, something changed. No one survived to describe what happened next. So every reconstruction has to begin with what was later found inside and around the tent. The group had not packed to leave. Their food, their backpacks, their camera, money, diaries, tools, route documents were all still inside the tent. Most of their winter boots were lined up inside the shelter. Many of their heavy coats and outer layers had also been left behind. Some food appeared to have been prepared or positioned for the group's final meal. Later reporting on the original inquest files suggested that the hikers died approximately 6 to 8 hours after eating. That estimate is not precise enough to create an exact minute-by-minute timeline. But it supports the idea that the emergency occurred sometime after the group had settled into the camp. A forensic examination of the tent identified 3 significant cuts measuring approximately 32, 89, and 42 centimeters. I'm not really great with centimeters. I don't really know how long that is. The experts who examined the fabric concluded that these cuts had been made with a sharp object from inside the shelter. Not every tear in the tent could be interpreted. The shelter had collapsed. It remained exposed to wind and snow for weeks. Searchers moved it and opened portions of the fabric, but at least several cuts were deliberately made from the inside. The hikers then left. And this is where one of the most repeated versions of the story becomes misleading. You will often hear that 9 terrified people sliced open the tent and ran barefoot in every direction. But that is not what the tracks showed. The footprints appeared to move together down the slope. Searcher Boris Lobsov later described tracks made by people wearing socks, soft felt footwear, or no proper shoes at all. Only one person may have had a single boot or shoe, and the tracks did not look like 9 people blindly sprinting away from one another. They traveled in roughly the same direction, and they initially remained close together. The visible trail continued for approximately 500 meters before being covered and erased by snowfall later. The eventual location of the bodies shows that the group continued toward the forest approximately 1.5 kilometers below the campsite. They were inadequately dressed, but they apparently walked, and that distinction matters. Whatever happened inside or around the tent was urgent enough that they would not take the time to properly dress themselves, but the descent itself may have been slightly organized. They could have believed the evacuation was temporary. They may have expected to wait a short time and return. Or some of them may have been injured and needed help moving. The forest offered 2 things that the exposed slope did not: protection from the wind and wood for a fire. So even though leaving the tent was extraordinarily dangerous, walking downhill toward the trees was not random. It was the only obvious place where they might survive if the campsite itself had become unsafe. The problem was that once they reached the forest, they were still a mile away from their boots, clothing, blankets, and food. And through blowing snow, darkness, and poor visibility, the tent may have disappeared completely into the white mountainside. So it's possible they wouldn't have been able to find their way back regardless. So before leaving for the trip, Igor had agreed to send a telegram to the group's sports club after they returned to Vizai. The message was expected no later than February 12th. So if you remember, this night they kind of disappeared was February 1st and 2nd. However, Igor had reportedly warned Yuri Yudin that the group could be delayed. So Yuri was the one who left early due to his health concerns. So he had sent, when he was on his way back, he told him, like, hey, tell them it might be later than February 12th. This was not unusual. Winter expeditions did not always remain perfectly on schedule. Snow, equipment problems, and navigation delays could add several days to a route. So when February 12th passed without a telegram, officials did not immediately launch a rescue operation. The hikers' families, however, were much more concerned. As more days passed without any message, relatives began demanding action. On February 20th, the Institute organized the first search teams. Those initial groups consisted largely of volunteer students and teachers familiar with hiking in that region. Police and military personnel later joined the operation. Aircraft and helicopters were used to search the enormous snow-covered landscape. This was not an area where searchers could simply follow a marked trail. The missing group had traveled deep into a region of mountains, rivers, forests, and wind-blown snow. And their last confirmed location was not known. Searchers first located the supply cache in Ospia Valley, and that showed that the group had successfully reached that point and then continued toward the mountain. On February 26th, Boris Slopsov and Mikhail Sherevin reached the eastern slope of Holat Cyclov. There they found the tent. Sherevin later described it as half collapsed and covered with snow and completely empty. The discovery immediately created more questions than answers. If the group had become lost, why were all of their belongings still there? If they had decided to abandon the expedition, why had they left their boots? And if someone had attacked them, where were the attackers' tracks? And why had the hikers cut open their own shelter from the inside? The searchers began following the footprints downhill, and at the edge of the forest, beneath a large Siberian cedar, they found the remains of a fire. Nearby were the first two bodies, Georgy and Yuri. Both men were badly underdressed for the conditions. Georgy was barefoot on one foot and wore only a damaged sock on the other. Yuri had socks but no proper winter boots. They were wearing underwear and limited layers that would have provided almost no protection against the wind and cold. Branches had been broken from the cedar as high as approximately 5 meters, or more than 16 feet above the ground. Someone had climbed the tree or repeatedly pulled at the branches high above the snow. And there are several possible reasons. They may have been collecting dry wood for their fire, and lower branches might have been damp or buried. Someone may have climbed the cedar to look for the tent, so maybe they were climbing up to see if they could find their tent again. From higher in the tree, they may have hoped to see a dark shape or a light of some indication of their campsite on the slope. Fragments of skin and clothing were reportedly found on the trunk, suggesting the climb had been desperate and physically damaging. So this was probably kind of like last-ditch efforts if like their skin was coming off on the tree. The fire beneath the tree had burned, and there were charred branches and pieces of clothing. But it had not been large enough or sustained long enough to keep two inadequately dressed men alive. The autopsies concluded that both of them had died from hypothermia. Georgy also had burns on his body. Some of the burns may have occurred because he remained dangerously close to the flames as he became weak or unconscious. One of the autopsy findings suggests that he had bitten a piece of tissue from his own hand. Whether that occurred because of pain, confusion, or an attempt to remain conscious is impossible to know. Several hundred meters uphill from the cedar, searchers found Igor Dyatlov. And then farther toward the tent, they discovered Zina. Rustem Slobodin was found later along the same general path, and Igor was approximately 300 meters from the cedar. So to kind of give you the layout here, Igor was approximately 300 meters away from that tree. Rustem was about 480 meters from the tree, and Zina was roughly 630 meters away from the tree. So kind of like in that line up towards where the tent was. Their bodies were positioned between the fire and the tent, facing generally uphill. That has led investigators to believe they were attempting to return to the campsite. And honestly, that's one of the most logical conclusions in the entire case. The fire wasn't enough, the group had no food, they had no shoes, they had no blankets, and the equipment required to keep anybody alive was still inside that tent. At some point, someone had to go back. And it looks like Igor, Zina, and Rustem may have attempted to climb together. Or they may have left at different times with the same goal. They may have followed tracks that were still visible before the wind erased them. But climbing through deep snow into strong wind and darkness, while wearing inadequate footwear, had consumed an enormous amount of energy. Igor never made it further than about 300 meters, and then Rustem a little bit further, and then Zina came the closest. The autopsies concluded that Igor and Zina died from hypothermia. Rustem also died from hypothermia, although he had a small fracture to his skull. The medical examiner did not believe the fracture was immediately fatal, but even a non-fatal head injury could have caused disorientation, weakness, or loss of consciousness. In that environment, a person did not need to be unconscious for long. 5 of the 9 hikers have now been found, meaning 4 were still missing. And investigators had not yet discovered the injuries that would turn the case into an international mystery. So, searchers continued examining the forest throughout March and April. So as we talked about, these conditions were very hard to search through. So it took a few extra months to find these other people because of the snow and everything like that. They used long probes to test areas where the snow was especially deep. As temperatures began to rise, portions of the snow packs shifted and melted. Near the beginning of May, searchers found pieces of cut clothing and a platform made from tree branches near a ravine approximately 75 meters beyond the cedar, so further away from the campsite, past the tree that they found those other people in that fire. The branches appeared to have been deliberately placed over the snow to create an insulated floor. This was likely the remains of an emergency snow shelter, and it's important evidence. The people in the forest had not simply panicked and stopped thinking. Someone gathered branches. Someone selected a location more protected than the base of the cedar. Someone cut clothing from the hikers who died first and redistributed it to people who were still alive. Someone attempted to create insulation between their bodies and the snow. And those are rational survival decisions. On May 4th, more than 3 months after the night of the incident, the remaining 4 hikers were found beneath approximately 4 meters or 13 feet of snow. Their bodies were located in or beside a stream at the bottom of a ravine. They were Ludmila Dubina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Tibobrinal, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were better dressed than the first 5, so some were wearing clothing that had originally belonged to Georgi and Yuri, and Ludmila was wearing portions of Georgi's burned and torn trousers. Her lower leg and foot had been wrapped in part of a jacket. This was sometimes described as evidence that the hikers had irrationally removed their clothing because of paradoxal undressing, so the phenomenon that can occur during severe hypothermia where your body thinks it's really hot, so you start removing your clothes. But the distribution of the garments suggests something more deliberate. The people who remained alive removed usable clothing from those who had already died to add layers to themselves, and they wrapped exposed limbs. They were trying to preserve whoever still had the best chance of surviving. Alexander's official cause of death was exposure to low temperature. The other 3 hikers found with him had devastating internal injuries. Nikolai had suffered a major depressed skull fracture, and the fracture extended across a significant portion of the skull and into its base. The injury was fatal. And Semyon had multiple, or Sasha as he liked to be called, had multiple fractures on the right side of his ribcage and severe internal bleeding. Ludmila had extensive fractures on both sides of her chest. Her injuries were especially severe. Multiple ribs were broken, and she had suffered massive bleeding into the chest cavity. The medical examiner compared the force necessary to produce injuries of this kind of trauma experienced in a serious vehicle collision. And yet they were the kind of external wounds many people would expect from like a violent beating. There were no documented gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no obvious weapon marks, no evidence that their chest had repeatedly been struck by another person. The damage was largely internal, as though the bodies had been subjected to intense pressure or compression. The medical examiner believed the injuries occurred while the hikers were alive. They were not simply fractures created when frozen remains were moved several months later. And this raised an immediate question. What on that mountain could generate enough pressure to crush a person's ribcage without leaving a clear external wound? So I think this is where people really get caught up because they're like, what are these terrible injuries that occurred to these people if like they were just left out in the cold, to die of hypothermia like some of the others? But what could cause that kind of pressure? A heavy mass of snow, maybe a fall onto rocks, a collapse inside a snow shelter could, maybe an explosive pressure wave. But the injuries alone do not tell us which of those events occurred. And then there was the condition of their faces. So I think this is probably the weirdest thing about it. Both Sasha and Ludmila were missing their eyes. Ludmila was also missing her tongue, portions of her lips, and other soft tissue from around her face. Alexander was missing tissue around his eyebrows. These injuries are disturbing and are also the reason that the theories involving torture and military interrogation and ritual killing kind of make their way into this story. But the environment where the bodies were found is critical. The 4 hikers remained buried for approximately 3 months. They were located in running water beneath several feet of snow, and as the snow melted, water moved continuously around the bodies. What they're saying is that soft tissue around the eyes, mouth, and lips is especially vulnerable to decomposition, water damage, and animal activity. Ludmila's face had been positioned against or near the flowing stream. Her exposed facial bones and loss of soft tissue were documented during the autopsy. But the report could not conclude about her tongue because it had looked like it had been intentionally cut out. But it did not identify knife marks showing deliberate removal. The medical examiner ultimately believed the facial injuries occurred after death. And that explanation is much less dramatic than torture, and it fits the location and condition in which the bodies were found. The missing tissue was real, but it was not proof that someone had mutilated them. And then there are details that started creating a conspiracy. Well, the missing eyeballs and tongue are part of it, but then there was the radiation. A radiological examination detected elevated beta radiation on several pieces of clothing recovered from the ravine. The highest readings were associated with portions of a sweater and trousers. The testing did not establish exactly when or where the clothing had become contaminated, and at least 2 members of the group had worked in environments associated with the Soviet nuclear industry. Georgy had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility and participated in cleanup following a serious radioactive accident. That provides at least one route for the contamination that had nothing to do with the hiker's death. But the radiation was real. The autopsies did not identify radiation poisoning as a cause of death. There was no widespread contamination across the entire campsite, and not every hiker's clothing produced the same result. The radiation does not explain why the group left the tent, and it does not prove that a nuclear device exploded above them. But people have questioned that. Another frequently repeated detail is that the hikers' bodies had orange or brown skin and gray hair. Yuri Kontsevich, who was 12 years old at the time of this happening, and he actually later helped establish the Dyatlov Foundation, attended several of the funerals. And he recalled the bodies having a deep brown or orange appearance, and relatives also made similar observations. But the bodies had been exposed to extreme cold, wind, decomposition, and post-mortem preparation. Changes in skin color are not unusual under those circumstances. Descriptions of gray hair may also have been influenced by frost, decomposition, chemicals used during examination, or the appearance of the bodies after recovery. But the coloring was unsettling. It's not reliable evidence of an unknown radiation weapon, but I can see why if you saw somebody and they had orange skin, you would think, that's kind of suspicious of some chemical warfare there. Then there were lights in the sky. So the night of, in the time when these people disappeared, other hikers located many miles away reported seeing orange spheres and glowing objects to the north. Additional witnesses in the wider region described unusual lights during February and March 1959. Some of those witnesses included members of the military and a meteorological service. This part of the story should not be dismissed as though every person who reported a light was lying. People did see something. The problem is connecting those observations to the Dyatlov group. Not all of the sightings occurred the same night. Some were weeks later. Some witnesses were many miles away. But the Soviet Union was conducting military and rocket activity during this period. The lights may have been rockets, military flares, atmospheric effects, or other testing. But even if an orange object appeared in the sky on the night of February 1st, it doesn't prove it forced the group out of their tent. There was no confirmed explosion of the site. No fragments of a weapon were documented. The surrounding trees had not been flattened or burned. The tent and its contents had not been destroyed by a blast. The strange light evidence is odd, but it's not automatically evidence of murder. The official investigation also created suspicion through its vagueness. The inquest was closed in May 1959 because no guilty party had been identified. The files were placed in an archive that was not freely accessible to the public, and access to the area was reportedly restricted for several years. In the Soviet Union, information about domestic accidents and military activity was routinely controlled. But to families and later researchers, the secrecy looked like proof that the officials were hiding something specific. And once that belief took hold, every unexplained detail became part of the cover-up. The radiation, the lights, the missing eyes and tongue, the internal injuries, the closed investigation, the restricted area. Some of those details are genuinely unusual, but unusual details are not necessarily connected details. So now we're going to walk through all of the theories that have been proposed as to what happened to these people. One of the earliest theories involved the Mansi. This is the indigenous people who lived and hunted throughout that region. Investigators considered whether the hikers had entered sacred territory and had been attacked. Several Mansi residents were questioned, but there was no physical evidence supporting the theory. The hikers' diaries described interest in Mansi language and culture rather than conflict. Local Mansi residents also participated in the search. Only the hikers' tracks were documented around the tent. There were no signs of a large group approaching from outside. Money, cameras, food, and valuable equipment remained at the campsite. So you'd think if they were being attacked, maybe someone would take some of the valuable things that they had in the tent. And the hikers' injuries did not resemble an attack involving knives, firearms, or other weapons. The theory appears to have developed primarily because the Mansi were local and unfamiliar to the investigators. It was not supported by the scene. Another theory suggested that escaped prisoners or criminals encountered the group. There were prison and labor camp facilities throughout portions of the Soviet North, so the idea was not completely invented from nothing. But again, no unidentified tracks, nothing was stolen, there was no evidence of confrontation. And 9 hikers leaving together without proper clothing would be a very bizarre response to criminals approaching from the outside. An attacker would also have needed to force the group a mile downhill without leaving a visible trail of their own. So there's, once again, no evidence that this happened. So the next is a fight within the group. Could the hikers have turned against one another? There were young men and women traveling together. There were friendships, crushes, and occasional disagreements. But nothing in the diaries suggested a conflict severe enough to become homicidal. More importantly, a fight does not explain the physical evidence. 9 people would not normally resolve an argument by collectively abandoning all their stuff, their boots, their coats, and their footprints showed they traveled together. And they would later work together to build a fire and snow shelter. Clothing was redistributed, and at least 3 hikers appeared to have tried to return to the campsite. Whatever happened, their behavior suggests cooperation together, not a group destroying itself over an argument. The next theory is an animal attack, but there's been no confirmed tracks from a large animal around the tent. An animal frightening them may have explained the sudden evacuation, but it would not explain why the group continued a full mile downhill or why no one returned once the animal was gone. It also does not account for the several internal injuries. The next theory is the Yeti theory, and this theory relies primarily on 2 things: the jokes about a snowman in the group's newspaper, and a blurry photograph found on one of the cameras. So as we mentioned, some of the cameras were left behind so they could develop the footage prior to them dying, obviously. And the photograph appears to show a human figure in heavy winter clothing, most likely a member of the expedition. So there are no unknown tracks, no claw marks, no evidence of a creature attacking the campsite. And I am comfortable ruling out the Yeti. You heard it here first. And maybe it's the most controversial position I'll ever take. I don't know, but I don't think it was a Yeti. The next theory is the military theory. And this one's more difficult to dismiss completely because the Soviet Union was conducting secret weapons testing in that area. Its government was also not known for transparency. Several versions involve parachute mines, rockets, chemical weapons, radioactive devices, or soldiers eliminating witnesses. Parachute mines were designed to detonate above the ground and create a powerful pressure wave. Supporters of this theory argue that this could explain several internal injuries without external damage expected from a direct explosion. The orange lights reported in the region are sometimes described as mines, rockets, or aircrafts. And the radioactive clothing is then added as evidence that there was maybe some secret weapons tests going on, and that either it accidentally kind of like exploded above where they were, with like the military not realizing they were there, obviously. But the theory has major problems because there's no confirmed parachute material recovered, no bomb fragments documented, and there were no clear blast sites. The one thing I want to say about that, though, is because like they were pretty secretive about the investigation. So like, would they tell everybody if there was parachute material recovered? I would guess no. The trees and tent were not damaged in a way that was consistent with a large nearby explosion, though. A pressure wave powerful enough to crush multiple rib cages should have affected the campsite and equipment much more dramatically. The hikers also left their cameras and diaries. If military did stage a scene, they did an extremely poor job of removing material that would fuel suspicion. The Soviet government may have concealed information about unrelated military activity. That's definitely possible. But government secrecy does not prove that a weapon killed the hikers. Another elaborate theory is a botched intelligence operation. So this suggests that one or more hikers were participating in an intelligence operation involving the controlled delivery of radioactive material to foreign agents. It's kind of a little bit out there, but under this theory, basically they're saying a meeting went wrong and the hikers were killed. This is based largely on the radioactive clothing and the professional backgrounds of several group members, especially some suspicions surrounding Simon or Sasha. But there's no verified evidence because he was the one who was like a little bit older and like joined at the last minute. There's no verified evidence that an intelligence meeting had been scheduled. No foreign agents were identified. No second group's tracks were found. And the condition of the scene still points toward the hikers leaving under their own power. It's a detailed story, but that doesn't necessarily make it a documented one. Okay, there's a few more theories here. One is talking about infrasound. So writer Donnie Ecker popularized a theory involving infrasound. The idea is that the wind moving around the mountain may have created a pattern known as a Kármán vortex street. So under particular conditions, air flowing around an obstacle can form alternating vortices or vortexes. So those vortices may produce a very low frequency sound, and so it's called infrasound. So basically, this low frequency sound can sometimes cause feelings of anxiety, discomfort, nausea, or unease. So the theory suggests that the hikers were experiencing a wave of intense, unexplained panic and fled the tent. So because of this infrasound. Once they moved downhill and out of the affected area, they regained composure, but could no longer locate their campsite. The major injuries may have occurred when the several hikers fell into the ravine, but the problem is that there is no evidence that the infrasound even occurred that night. And there's also limited evidence that it would cause 9 experienced people to make the same complex decision at the same time. It's definitely an interesting environmental theory, but it depends on a phenomenon that was never measured at the campsite. The next being a katabatic wind, which is a powerful downslope wind created when dense, cold air rushes from higher elevation toward lower ground. So these winds can become sudden and violent. In 2019, members of a Swedish-Russian expedition traveled to the area and proposed that a katabatic wind could have forced the hikers from their shelter. A similar type wind was considered in a 1978 disaster at Inaris Mountain in Sweden, where 8 hikers died. Under the Dyatlov theory, the wind became so violent that remaining inside the tent was impossible. The hikers may have covered or secured the shelter, left a flashlight on top as a beacon, and descended to the forest to wait for the wind to weaken. The flashlight found on the snow is interesting in that context. It may have simply just been dropped, but it's also possible that the hikers deliberately left it visible so that they could find the tent again. Once they reached the forest, however, the wind and snow continued, and the tent disappeared from view. The group built a fire and at least one snow shelter. The katabatic wind theory can explain why they sought protection among the trees. And it can explain why returning uphill became impossible. It can even work alongside the theory that a shelter near the ravine later collapsed. But wind alone does not fully explain why the group cut through the tent instead of using the entrance. And a wind powerful enough to make the tent completely uninhabitable might be expected to damage or carry away more of the campsite. It remains plausible as a contributing factor, but it's harder to prove as the single trigger. The next theory is just like a traditional avalanche. So this was considered during the original investigation and has remained one of the leading explanations ever since. It also faces several obvious objections. The tent had not been swept down the slope. Skis and poles remained near the campsite. Searchers did not describe a massive debris field, and the slope appeared too shallow. Footprints remained visible below the tent, and the bodies found during that February-March search were not buried beneath a large avalanche deposit. More than 100 expeditions have later traveled through that region without reporting any major avalanches at that exact campsite. Researchers also argued that the prevailing wind could remove snow from the ridge rather than deposit enough to create a slide. So basically, they think it would just kind of blow rather than create an avalanche slide, I guess. Igor was also experienced. Sasha, was trained for advanced certification as a hiking instructor. Why would either man place a tent directly beneath an obvious avalanche path? The tracks are another problem. They did not look like people running in uncontrolled terror. The hikers appeared to walk downhill together. A large, fast-moving avalanche sweeping across the campsite does not fit that evidence particularly well. But a large avalanche is not the same thing as a small slab release. So this brings us to more modern investigation of these events. So in 2019, Russian prosecutors reopened the investigation. They limited their review to natural explanations, including a traditional avalanche, a slab avalanche, and extreme wind. Murder was not treated as a serious possibility. In 2020, investigators announced that an avalanche was the most likely cause. Their reconstruction argued that snow shifted above or around the tent, forcing the hikers to evacuate into severe weather. Once they reached what they believed was a safe distance, darkness and low visibility prevented them from finding the campsite again. Later reviews also emphasized how severe the weather may have been. Estimates include temperatures potentially approaching negative 40 degrees and winds between roughly 45 and 67 miles per hour. Negative 40 degrees is freezing, and that's actual temperature, not like feels like. Here in the Midwest, we get in the middle of the winter, sometimes in really cold times, we'll get like small negative numbers with wind chill, but like, oh my God, that's freezing. People would not survive long out in that, especially if they're not wearing shoes. Those numbers, though, are reconstructions. They're not direct measurements taken beside the tent, but they illustrate the kind of environment the group may have faced. Officials described the hikers' actions as a heroic struggle rather than a blind panic. They evacuated an area that they believed was dangerous. They moved toward the protection of the tree line, started a fire, created an emergency shelter. They attempted to return for supplies. The problem was not that they did nothing correctly. The problem was that the conditions gave them no margin for error. In 2021, snow scientist Johan Gom and a geotechnical engineer, Alexander Puzrin, published a more specific model. They proposed that the hikers had cut into the slope to create a level platform for the tent, and that cut may have weakened a buried layer of snow. So the tent itself rested on like a compacted snow reinforced by skis, which was like a relatively hard surface beneath where the hikers were. But above them, then the dense slab may have been like weakened a little bit by them digging into it. So the slab would not collapse immediately. Strong winds continued transporting snow onto the slope above the campsite. So like more snow was accumulating still above it then. And hours later, the additional load may have caused a compact section of the snow to break free. So not like a full-on avalanche, but like a small compact section. And this would not necessarily look like a giant wall of snow, like what you think of when you picture like an avalanche happening on the side of a mountain. It may have been relatively small, but extremely dense. Large enough to fall across part of the tent, large enough to pin people against the hard floor and the skis, and large enough to produce serious chest and skull injuries. But maybe not potentially large enough to carry the entire tent down the mountain or leave like an obvious debris field 3 weeks later. The researchers' simulations found that a slab under the right conditions could produce injuries similar to those documented in the autopsy. Their work also accounted for the delayed timing between cutting the slope and a possible collapse. Follow-up expeditions documented slab avalanches in the wider Dyatlov Pass area and found that portions of the terrain near the campsite were steeper than they appeared from some angles. But the researchers were careful. Their model showed that the event was physically possible, but it did not prove that that's what happened. So then they think potentially maybe part of their tent collapsed after the slab shifts. Some hikers might be injured or pinned. They cut through the fabric to escape because the entrance is blocked. They hear cracks or movement, so maybe they believe a larger avalanche could follow. So they move toward the forest. At the tree line, they build the fire. Someone climbs the cedar tree to look for the campsite or gather wood. A second group constructs a snow shelter near the ravine. Georgie and Yuri die near the fire. Their clothing is redistributed. Igor, Zena, and Rustam attempt to return to the tent for supplies, but they collapse on the slope. And then those final 4 are near the ravine. And those already suffering from major injuries eventually die from trauma and exposure. and then Alexander dies from hypothermia. But there are problems with that exact sequence of events because moving a person with a catastrophic skull fracture more than a mile through deep snow would have been extraordinarily difficult, meaning they don't know that it's possible that if they were hurt in like that avalanche situation, that those people who got those severe injuries could have been transported and died later down at at the ravine. So Ludmila's chest injuries were severe enough that walking any significant distance would have been nearly impossible, which leads some investigators to believe that the injuries occurred later, like once they were actually near the ravine. The hikers may have fallen through the roof of a snow-covered stream channel, or a snow shelter could have collapsed, or a heavy mass of compacted snow may have fallen onto them when they were already down there, or several hikers may have dropped onto rocks hidden beneath the snow. And that version of events explains why the 3 people with the most serious injuries were found together in the ravine. But then the original evacuation still needs another explanation. Perhaps the hikers did not suffer the fatal trauma at the tent, but perhaps they heard or saw a small movement of snow, feared a much larger avalanche, and evacuated before anyone was seriously injured, and then those injuries occurred later at the ravine, like I was saying. So this is way less cinematic than like a secret weapon or like secret military things, but this is often how real disasters happen. Not because one impossible event, but because several survivable problems occur in the worst possible order. So the original Soviet investigation concluded that the hikers had died because of a compelling or overwhelming natural force that they were unable to overcome. That wording was vague. The files were not openly available for decades, and the government did very little to explain how investigators had reached that conclusion. Over time, every confusing fact became proof of something larger. Missing eyes became torture, radioactive clothing became a nuclear weapon, a joke about a snowman became a Yeti sighting, lights in the sky became missiles. The lack of a detailed official explanation became proof that officials knew exactly what had happened and were hiding it. But the hikers' actual behavior was not as irrational as it is often presented. They did not scatter randomly. They moved together toward the nearest natural shelter. These are not actions of 9 people who instantly lost their minds. They are actions of people attempting to solve an emergency while freezing, injured, and unable to see. The central question has always been, why would experienced hikers leave their tent without their boots? And I think the most likely answer is that in that moment, they believed remaining inside was more dangerous than leaving. They probably expected to return. Maybe they thought they would wait below the slope for a few minutes, and then without a compass or visible landmark, they may not have known exactly which direction to climb back. The people who tried to reach the campsite died facing uphill. The people who remained below ran out of fire, strength, and time. Dyatlov Pass is often introduced as a story in which 9 experienced hikers ripped open their tent, ran barefoot into the snow, and were later found mutilated by an unknown force. That description is not completely false, but it is designed to make the events sound impossible. A more accurate version is this. 9 experienced hikers evacuated a damaged or threatened shelter. They traveled together toward the tree line. They attempted multiple survival strategies. 6 died primarily from hypothermia. 3 suffered fatal physical trauma. The bodies recovered 9 months later from running water had undergone significant post-mortem damage. I'm still not convinced about the tongue thing, though. Like, I get soft tissue would, like, decompose first, but I'm like, okay, was it cut out? Okay. So some clothing carried radioactive contamination, but the radiation did not kill the group. There's no reliable physical evidence that shows another person or creature was present. The exact triggers remain uncertain. The best theory is that small avalanche or threatening movement of snow, followed by extreme weather, disorientation, injury, and hypothermia, currently explain more of the physical evidence with fewer unsupported assumptions than any of the more sensational theories. Maybe the reason this case remains so haunting is not because the answer has to be supernatural. Maybe it's because the line between a difficult expedition and an irreversible disaster can be incredibly thin. One decision to camp on an exposed slope, one weak layer hidden beneath the snow, one section of shelter collapsing, one descent made with the belief that you can come back, and then the wind erases the only path home. 9 people died on that mountain. The mountain pass that now carries Igor Dyatlov's name is actually located more than a mile from the exact campsite. The name was given to the wider area in memory of that expedition. A memorial now stands near the location, but the mystery belongs to all 9 of those people. They deserve to be remembered as more than the bodies in one of internet's favorite unsolved stories. They were friends, students, engineers, veterans, musicians, instructors, experienced travelers. And judging by the evidence they left behind, they fought extremely hard to survive. I'm Kat, and I still have questions. Stay curious. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.